Hello, I'm John McQuillan, Senior Editor at the Harvard Kennedy School Student Policy Review. And today I have the pleasure of having Gita Wirjawan to talk about Indonesia and Southeast Asia kind of economic development. Gita's had an amazing and distinguished career in the private and public sector. He was the Trade Minister of Indonesia in 2011, where he led a lot of foreign direct investment into the country, among other things. He's the founder of the Axiata Group, also a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, and also the host of the very acclaimed Endgame podcast. So Gita, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. The first question, when I was preparing for this interview, I looked at an interview you did with Charlie Rose in 2011, and you talked about bringing back some memories there. But
I was a lot younger.
No, you look the same. But I was looking at the interview, and you kind of talked about some of the amazing accomplishments Indonesia had achieved, but also some of the serious challenges, being very commodity driven,
right.
Trying to diversify its economy, trying to have vertical integration, become more of a knowledge economy. So kind of, are those some of the same challenges Indonesia faces today? And kind of what's the progress you've seen in the country since then in 2011?
Still is. I think it's, I took the long view, and I'm still taking the long view.
Yeah.
If you take a look at the way money moves, or call it foreign direct investment, into many developing economies around the world, including Indonesia, it's still mostly towards the bottom of the value chain. And whatever we do in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, would be to make sure that we can climb up the value chain. There's still a lot of stuff that needs to be invested in at the bottom parts of the value chain. I think that's going to be the case for the near foreseeable future. However, it's not that we're not looking for smart capital. And I think we've been able to get a lot of smart capital in Southeast Asia. Surely Singapore has been at the forefront of this, but I think Singapore has been a really good example to the other countries in Southeast Asia where we would try to basically invest a lot more in education, the way Singapore has done in the past few decades. And if we were to compare the economic performance of Southeast Asia with respect to that of China in the last 30 years, we basically have grown our GDP per capita at 2.7 times, China at 10 times, and it's highly identifiable as to why. And it's mainly because of underinvestment in education, underinvestment in infrastructure, a lack of governance, and lack of competitiveness. But we've identified these, and I think it all depends on the kind of view taking that the policymakers in Southeast Asia would have to do. And I'm in the optimistic camp in that I think for the most part, I think we are all much more optimistic about the next 30 years for Southeast Asia's sake.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that statistic is pretty striking with the GDP growth per capita between China and Southeast Asia. But another thing you've also talked about that you kind of advocate for, in the same breath of education investment, infrastructure investment, you talk about storytelling and the importance of providing storytelling for Southeast Asia. Why do you think Southeast Asia hasn't been more effective at telling its story? And is there a country or a region that you look to to model that for the future?
Well, Singapore is blessed in that everybody in Singapore speaks English.
Right.
Right. The Philippines, they have a lot of people being able to speak English. Malaysia too, but you look at the rest. Indonesia, probably no more than 10 million people would be able to speak English, eloquently with people like you, in a context of 280 million people. So I imagine a future where and when there could be 100 million people in Indonesia that could speak English and tell the stories to anybody around the world. I imagine a future where and when, instead of maybe around 70 million people in Southeast Asia, we have 400 million people in a context of a population of 700 million people to be able to speak English and tell the stories. That, I think, will change the game and in a very big way. And this is why not many people talk about Southeast Asia. They get a lot more excited about talking about Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan at the rate that, their population sizes are a lot smaller than ours, and even their, individual economic sizes, are smaller than our collective economic size for Southeast Asia, which is, around $4 trillion economy. But I think the onus is on us to actually, find a better optimum between power and talent to basically get ourselves much better educated at the non-tertiary level and also at the tertiary level, and create the necessary fiscal space, create the necessary monetary space, and also be able to project the narrative to first ourselves and to the rest of the world. That, I think, will happen. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months, but I think it will happen in the near foreseeable future.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, really communicate. It's 700 million people, almost $4 trillion economy. I mean, it's a massive region in terms of economic force, demographic force. And that language attainment, you said around 100 million don't speak. Only 100 million speak English as opposed to 700 million. I mean, how do you think, besides investing in education, I know you've been very optimistic about technology. AI is something you've talked about. I mean, how can Southeast Asia utilize AI, utilize these kind of emerging technologies that have some pessimism associated with them, but for example, to increase English language attainment? I mean, kind of what's your perspective on that?
I am more optimistic about using AI to get a lot more people to be able to speak English. I'm involved in a couple of platforms that have actually been using AI to get people to learn how to speak English and other international languages. If you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have been a lot more pessimistic in terms of the duration with which it would take for a lot more people to be able to speak international languages. But right now, I'm a lot more optimistic about the duration with which we're going to be able to reach scale. 3 years ago, if you asked me, it could take us 30 years to get to the kinds of numbers that I've mentioned in terms of being able to communicate internationally. Right now, probably between 5 to 10 years, I think we can reach those. So that I think is a source of optimism for many people in Southeast Asia.
That's exciting. I think another point that I think you've advocated for and communicated, which I think is really interesting, is the kind of the potential for Southeast Asia to grow in its internationalism and its presence. Indonesia as well, of course. And you've, I mean, again, in your time in the government, you really pushed for foreign direct investment as a way forward. And so many countries in Southeast Asia have really benefited from a globalized economy. If you look at Malaysia, Vietnam as well, really have opened up and been very successful. But I think it's in contrast to some of the kind of trends on deglobalization. I mean, you kind of see the trade war a bit with the Trump administration and China, with the steel and aluminum tariffs that kind of have continued over under the Biden administration. I mean, there's less faith in a globalized economy. I think it's quite popular to kind of be more, and of course the pandemic made supply chain resiliency more important than more open. The World Trade Organization, we have the appellate bodies being held up by the U.S. kind of in response to what they feel is unfair practices by China. So it's a pessimistic time for globalization. I mean, I think that's probably the most pessimistic time since it was kind of formed, the world order was formed since World War II. So how do you advocate for this internationalism and kind of where you're trying to, that concern of these backsliding on that kind of that realm?
I think quite sadly, that's likely to stay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Unfortunately, in a more multipolar kind of order, there's an inevitable decline of the ability to multilateralize, and this is natural by way of the revisionism that's coming from, call it the BRICS, call it the middle powers, call it the global south, that probably would not want to embrace the pre-existing, call it the liberal order, the way that we would have had to when it was a much more unipolar type of world order.
Right.
And that revisionism, I think, is warranted at the rate that, the BRICS, the middle powers, the global south, they're getting much larger than whatever they would have been 50 years ago,
right,
a few decades ago. So this, not tussle, but tension, I think it's going to entail, greater need to bilateralize greater need to plurilateralize. In the context of having to bilateralize, I think what matters most structurally is the ability of a nation to increase marginal productivity, right? Because your competitiveness, hinges on how productive you are. Whereas in a much more multilateral setting, you can sort of piggyback on a large friend of yours to help you negotiate with another large, friend who has a competitive advantage over you. That, I think, is going to stick around for the near foreseeable future, call it the next 5 to 10 years. So the onus is really on Southeast Asia to increase marginal productivity, right? There's a few building blocks, which I've alluded to earlier in terms of ramping up educational attainment, ramping up, the optimum of, the intersection between power and talent, and then creating that extra fiscal space, extra monetary space, and then being able to tell the stories. I do believe that this presents an opportunity for Southeast Asia to, if we get those acts together in terms of building the building blocks, to help reconstruct or reshape or reenact, the sort of multilateralism that we had seen for a long time.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And also another issue that I think is kind of we're faced with is, of course, climate change. I think that's a omnipresent topic of concern, but also optimism about new technology. But you've expressed that I think some of the, especially from some Western countries like the United States, the goal setting of a carbon neutral 2050 date is a little bit too optimistic, especially for developing countries that are really prioritizing how can we get food on the table, how can we have affordable electricity and energy, and a lot of that is still through coal and non-renewable resources. So how does this kind of conflict with countries really pushing for a 2050 date, trying to address the concerns of climate change? There's a kind of conflict there with the economic interests of a lot of developing countries. Just could you kind of share your insight on this?
Take large developing economies like India and Indonesia. Each is electrified at a rate of about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. And I define anybody's ability to embrace the narrative of sustainability as one that can actually think in a modern manner. And I take a look at modernity being defined in many measures, one of which is really electrification on a per capita basis. And I look at modernity being defined at a rate of at least 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Then you try to figure out how long would it take for India to go up from 1,300 to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Indonesia from 1,300 to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita at a rate that India can only build 19,000 megawatts per year in terms of power generation capabilities, and at a rate that Indonesia can build only 3,000 megawatts of power generation capabilities per year. It'll take more than 100 years. For both India and Indonesia, which is totally irreconcilable with the 2050 or 2060 deadline in terms of attaining carbon neutrality. 2050 is only 26 years away, whereas these two developing economies will need more than 100 years to attain modernity. So I think there needs to be some thinking about how to accelerate the process, and also to do it on a renewable basis. So go back to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's pre-existing power generation capabilities would be less than 1 terawatt. But if all of Southeast Asia were to get to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, with the absolute exception of Singapore and Brunei, which are already at about 9 to 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita, we would need to build an additional 1 terawatt worth of power generation capabilities. So at a rate of $2 million per megawatt, we're talking about needing about $2 trillion.
Right.
So that's, I think, the economic challenge, right? Aside from the moral challenge of being or becoming environmentally friendly, can we get that $2 trillion? Yeah, I think so. But, the way money flows from one place to another is not because of ideology, it's not because of geography, it's not because of whether or not they're natural resources, but it's predominantly because of the trustworthiness of the system. We call that rule of law. So to the extent that I think all these Southeast Asian countries can actually get their act together on the rule of law, I think there's reason to believe that we can get those $2 trillion because the liquidity in the world is so rampant. There's more than $100 trillion of liquidity, most of which is sitting in the G7 countries. So this goes back to the earlier reference, right, of our ability to be able to internationalize the communication, but also at the same time build upon that necessary building block of making sure that the system is trustworthy, the rule of law is upheld.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very detailed answer on such an important topic. Another kind of back on storytelling. I think one thing that I think is interesting, Southeast Asia's 11 countries, extraordinarily diverse, politically, economically, it's just a very diverse region. And ASEAN's done a pretty admirable job of working with all of them and trying to create some unification here. But how do you tell a story of such a varied region? What's your perspective on that? That's quite a challenge, I think.
It's an under-narrated region, which is blessed with tremendous peace and stability. I go back 2,000 years. In the last 2,000 years, this region has been graced by Buddhism for 400 years, Hinduism for 600 years, colonization, Islam, Christianity, independence, democratization for the next 600-700 years, with relatively very few fatalities. If you take a look at the fatalities, the number of lives lost by way of differences of views or opinions with regards to race, ethnicity, or religion, no more than 10 million lives. If we were to compare that with what we saw in Europe in the same 2,000-year period, the number is much higher. Just between the two world wars, we're looking at, slightly over 100 million lives lost. So it's got tremendous peace and stability, right? Which I think is sine qua non for any kind of economic prosperity. But to be able to attain that economic prosperity, you got to get educated. Right, and this is where Singapore has been able to be good at, right? They've embraced the culture of pragmatism and also the culture of principles. Yeah. They know how to put food on the table. They know how to increase the intellect of the people, the moral value, the social value, the healthcare, the welfare, and all that good stuff. So I think this is the kind of stuff that the other countries in Southeast Asia are sort of like pinching, their face with. Oh, okay, I think I think we know what to do. We just got to do a bit more of what the Singaporeans have, been able to get at, be good at. I think the long view could be pretty interesting for Southeast Asia because of that underlying peace and stability. So the delta beyond that is really about, those building blocks that, we've been talking about.
I'd be curious, with you, and I think that's a pretty clear narrative that you're providing there, and I think you are definitely one of the storytellers for Southeast Asia. You're modest, but but that's the truth. Your podcast has millions of views. You advocate for this. You're speaking at Harvard on this topic. Historically, there's a lot of storytellers for Southeast Asia. There's Sukarno for Indonesia, informing a lot of work that kind of informs some philosophy. You have, of course, Lee Kuan Yew is one of the most well-known and famous political leaders that shapes how a lot of people view Singapore and made it a per weight country, considering how small it is, how much it impacts the world is amazing. Who are some of the people or the figures that you see that can be the storytellers to carry on these kind of figures? It's a lofty mantle, but
from Southeast Asia?
From Southeast Asia,
Lee Kuan Yew is the ultimate storyteller. Here's a guy that came from a country at that time of a lot fewer than 5.5 million today. Back then, he was able to project, greatness, intellectually. And he was able to basically be pretty prescient about some of the stuff that was happening in many parts of the world, to the point he had been consulted by various leaders of multi-dimensions from many parts of the world. Beyond him, you've got the more junior Singaporeans that are not young anymore.
Right.
But the Singaporeans, they've been blessed with that wherewithal to speak internationally, English language. And this was what Lee Kuan Yew put a lot of premium on. In spite of the fact that, ethnically there would have been diversity, right? Those that would have been of Indian descent, Malay descent, Chinese descent, or Eurasian descent. But he made sure that everybody would be able to speak English, because he had always believed that English was the language that was necessary to learn most of the wisdom in the world, most of the know-how, knowledge of the world. And English was the language that was involved in most economic activities around the world. So it's actually a simple way of thinking, but beyond the next, generation of Singaporeans, we've got, many young, hungry, thirsty storytellers in the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. I don't have time to name all the names, but, you've got Kishore Mahbubani, you've got Giorgio, you've got Bilahari Kausikan, and I'd like to become one. You've got, so many in the other countries. But, we'll take it one step at a time. I think we'll get there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'd be curious. I mean, we're at Harvard right now, and I think not just at Harvard, but I think there's been a big discussion about U.S.-China. That's a constant kind of topic of interest, and you have some figures that have are comparing it now to the Cold War 2.0, right? That U.S.-China is basically the same as U.S.-Russia, USSR, and that there's a lot of similarities. And that's growing in popularity. You have some Congressman Gallagher came and spoke at the IOP forum a couple months ago and advocated for this view. What's your perspective? Is that a helpful analogy? Is it a harmful analogy? As someone who's kind of thinking about how Southeast Asia can move forward, and what's your view on this?
I think what cannot be underestimated is the degree of agency within Southeast Asia. And this goes back to the peace and stability that we've been able to, chart for ourselves in the last 2,000 years. And it just underlines our ability, if not great ability, to deal, if not embrace multipolarity.
Yeah.
Right? In the last 2,000 years, what would make any Asian think that we're not going to be able to embrace multipolarity? So I do believe with a region of 700 million people with a rich history of multipolarity or embracing multipolarity, rich history of agency, I don't think we're going to be easily pushed to a corner as to choose between a Huawei or an iPhone, right? And that, I think, needs to be understood a little bit more clearly. But I don't think, going forward, we're going to stop right there. I think we're going to figure out a way to build upon those building blocks that I've alluded to earlier. To the extent we could do that effectively, efficiently, and successfully, then I think we're going to be able to play a pretty big part in reenacting, the kind of multilateralism that we saw, for decades, which unfortunately is on a decline. Now, what I think seems a little bit strange is the rate at which, we're seeing, how Russia is actually getting closer to China, right? And this is a bit counter to some of the advocacies of the likes of Henry Kissinger, who in the early 70s would have wanted China to actually be close to the United States as to help contain the Soviet Union then. It just seems counterintuitive, whatever we're seeing, developing. Now, we hope that, we're going to fall into this, what Professor Graham Allison has always referred to, the Thucydides trap, as one of the 4 scenarios out of the 16, not one out of the 12,
right,
out of the 16 that actually turned out in wars, right? I do believe that there is enough reasons for China and the U.S. to be able to coexist and compete peacefully, as for everybody around the world to be able to benefit. To benefit.
Yeah, that's. Thank you for that. Very thoughtful and great job pronouncing Thucydides trap.
Thucydides.
Yeah, that's. I've repeated that pronunciation that Graham Allison is obviously famous for. But great work with that. To kind of leave us with the last question. When I was doing preparing for this interview, I spoke with Professor Ronner Mitter, who teaches on Asia and China and at the Kennedy School here. And I asked him, I mentioned that I was interviewing you, and he said, you're always looking forward, that you're interested in the future and what's next. And so I'd just be curious, that kind of communicates a level of idealism about the world and about the future. So what are you excited about? What are you idealistic about to kind of leave our listeners on, our viewers on the world, Southeast Asia, but maybe globally as well? Just kind of what's your optimism?
AI is something or a space that could benefit the planet. But the way I see it, economically, you believe some pundits who would have pontificated that AI is going to accrue, I don't know, between 50 to $100 trillion worth of economic delta in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
There is a concern that most of that is only going to accrue to China and the U.S. Right? There is a concern that for many of us in Southeast Asia that we're not going to be a big beneficiary. We're just going to be bystanders. There is a concern that Southeast Asia runs the risk of just becoming primarily a consumer, secondarily an enabler, not a creator. Right? So it goes back to the onus of having to build these building blocks going forward. So I foresee a future, hopefully not too distantly, where we're going to be able to do something so that a chunk of that $50 to $100 trillion would accrue meaningfully to Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah.
If that were to happen before we get all the other technological innovations that could be disruptive and economically beneficial, call it blockchain, call it robotics, energy storage, and genomics, I think Southeast Asia would be much more relevant than it is or it has been so far, at least conversationally, hopefully economically, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you. I think we got a wide-ranging topics and really enjoyed your time. So thank you for fitting us in. And thank you all for watching the Harvard Kennedy School Student Policy Review. Please check out our other interviews as well as our articles. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great evening.
Thank you, John.